The banquet was already in full swing when Elias Cole saw the child, not dressed for velvet ropes and crystal chandeliers, just a faded hoodie, scuffed sneakers, and eyes too wide to have been invited. They stood at the far end of the hallway, still as stone, clutching nothing but a question. "They said it's for families," the child whispered. "Am I allowed?" 5 words, small, unpolished, that landed in Elias's chest like a stone in water, and before the night ended, those words would rewrite not just his life, but the meaning of the word family itself. The banquet was already full when Elias Cole walked in. Tables lined with polished silverware and wine glasses sparkled under a chandelier shaped like a constellation. The annual Cole Foundation dinner wasn't just a celebration of funding milestones. It was a statement. Every major partner was there. Everyone who wanted to be seen had made sure to show up. Elias, as always, arrived last, not because he wanted the attention, but because walking in when the room was already humming made it easier to stay quiet, invisible even, if he played it right. He passed the usual handshakes, the carefully worded compliments, the awkward attempts at small talk about legacy. He kept moving, toward the back, toward the edge of the room where the air wasn't so heavy with expectation. That's when he saw them, a child alone, standing at the far end of the hallway near the grand doors. Too small to be part of the catering team, too still to be there by accident. A faded hoodie, scuffed sneakers, wide eyes that hadn't blinked in a while. Elias slowed. The child looked up at him, uncertain, then spoke. "They said it's for families. Am I allowed?" 5 words, simple, small, but they landed like a stone in his chest. He stepped closer. "What's your name?" "Devon." Elias looked toward the banquet room. No one had noticed. No one was missing this child. No one was coming. "Who are you here with?" Devon shrugged. "No one. I just saw the sign. It said families welcome, so I thought—" The sentence trailed off. But Elias didn't need it finished. He remembered what it felt like to stand in a doorway and wonder if belonging was something you had to be born into. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Devon nodded, cautious. Elias held out a hand. "Then you're allowed." Devon stared at it for a long second, then placed their small hand in his. Together they walked back toward the ballroom, past the velvet ropes, past the finely dressed guests, through the kind of space where a child didn't usually belong. No one stopped them. No one dared. Elias led Devon to a seat at his table, pulled out a chair, signaled for an extra plate, a second glass, a napkin folded into a triangle. "Is this okay?" Devon asked, whispering. Elias looked down. "This is more than okay." "But I'm not dressed like everyone else." "You're not supposed to be. You're exactly right." Devon looked down at the polished plate, at the candle flickering in the center of the table, then back at him. "Are you the one in charge?" "Sort of." Devon nodded. "You seem like someone who doesn't forget things." Elias blinked. "I try not to." Devon picked up a roll carefully. "Then don't forget I asked if I was allowed." "I won't." Because the truth was, he already knew he never would. Dinner carried on around them, but Elias barely noticed. People spoke, laughed, raised glasses. Speeches happened. A video played on a massive screen. Something about milestones, partnerships, the Foundation's future. But his eyes stayed on the child beside him, who was trying to butter a roll without making crumbs on the crisp white tablecloth. Devon didn't fidget, didn't ask for more, didn't interrupt. They just existed there, quietly, as if trying not to take up more space than they'd been allowed, like being invisible was a practiced skill. Elias leaned in a little. "Have you ever been to something like this before?" Devon shook their head. "Only watched through windows. You can hear music even from the sidewalk if the doors are open." Elias thought of all the years he'd walked into rooms like this without questioning if he belonged. He'd earned his way in, of course, built it brick by brick, but he'd also been given the assumption of access. There had never been a guardrail between him and the warmth inside. Devon took a careful bite. "Is it really for families?" He nodded slowly. That was the idea. "But some people don't have them." The sentence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't baiting for sympathy. It was just a fact, laid down flat. "I didn't either," Elias said. "Not the kind that went to dinners like this. Not the kind that saved a seat." Devin looked up at him then, head tilted, curiosity replacing caution. "Then how did you get in?" Elias smiled, just a little. "Same way you did. I showed up." Devin was quiet for a while after that, long enough for dessert to be served, raspberry tarts with gold-dusted chocolate. They poked at theirs with a fork, then asked, "What happens after this?" Elias looked at them. "You mean tonight?" "No, I mean like, what happens to people who sit at the edge of something and hope they're allowed?" He sat back, studied their face, and said, "If they're lucky, someone makes room." Devin blinked once. "Are you making room for me?" "Yes," Elias said, voice steady, "and I'm not the only one who should." At the end of the banquet, when the music faded and the guests trickled out, Elias stood and helped Devin out of their chair. They both walked toward the exit, past people who glanced and smiled politely, but didn't ask questions. Outside, the night air was cool. The city buzzed in the distance. Devin looked up at him, that same careful calm still in their eyes. "Thanks for not asking me why I was there." Elias looked down. "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted." Devin nodded. "Most people start with the questions. You didn't." Some stories begin better when they aren't pulled. Devin smiled then, just a little. "Will I see you again?" "Yea, sir," Elias said. "But next time you'll be invited." And in the soft quiet of that city night, Elias understood something new. Sometimes family doesn't arrive with names or bloodlines. Sometimes it begins with 5 words at a door. They said it's for families. "Am I allowed?" And a hand offered without condition. The next morning, Elias woke early. He wasn't due at the office for hours, but he found himself sitting at his kitchen table with a blank notepad in front of him and the memory of Devin's voice still looping in his head. "They said it's for families. Am I allowed?" It was the kind of question that didn't just echo, it rooted. He'd been thinking about it all night. Not just about Devin, but about every version of that moment he'd overlooked in the past, the people at the edges, the ones who hovered outside warmth and waited for someone to turn and see them. He started writing. By the time the sun rose, the notepad had 3 pages filled. Program ideas, youth initiative drafts, contact names. He didn't even realize he was designing something until it was already sketched out. A new arm of the Cole Foundation, not a scholarship, not a mentoring program, and something in between. He titled the page, "The Welcome Project." That same afternoon he returned to the hotel. Devin had never said where they came from, no last name, no address. But Elias asked the front desk manager if anyone had reported a missing child or had come looking. No one had. Not that night. Not the next morning. But the security guard who had worked the banquet told him something. Kid was sitting by the door an hour before the event even started. Didn't say a word, just waited. "We figured they'd leave when the crowd showed up." "They didn't," Elias said. "No," the guard replied. "Guess they were hoping someone might open the door wide enough." Elias nodded. "Next time, make sure they don't have to wait outside." A few days later, a handwritten envelope arrived at the foundation's office. No return address, just his name. Inside was a piece of lined paper folded in quarters. It read, "Thank you for not saying I needed a reason. Thank you for not asking who I belonged to. Thank you for letting me sit down." D. Attached was a small drawing, a table, 2 chairs, a plate in front of each seat. One had a crown resting beside it. The other had a hand reaching across the table. At the top, Devin had written, "This is what it feels like when the answer is yes." Elias stared at it for a long time. He didn't frame it, not yet. He kept it in his desk drawer, close, like a quiet promise. And that night, when he met with his team and presented the Welcome Project, he started the meeting with a story, not of statistics, not of funding or visibility, but of a child, alone at the door of a banquet, asking the most honest question he'd ever heard. "Am I allowed?" and how the only answer that had ever mattered was the one he gave without hesitation. You are now. In the weeks that followed the banquet, Elias couldn't stop seeing Devon. Not literally, they hadn't crossed paths again since that night, but in his memory, in the quiet moments, in every echo of every voice that never got asked in. Devon had entered his life like a whisper, and somehow stayed like a thread pulled tight across every part of his day. At board meetings, he found himself tuning out mid-sentence, distracted by the thought of how many other Devons had waited at other doors. How many had turned around before someone opened it. He thought about the way Devon had stood still, not begging, not interrupting, just asking. They said it's for families. Am I allowed? It had haunted him. And not because it was sad, because it was true. It was a truth no one talked about in rooms like his, rooms with clinking glasses and applause on cue, rooms full of people who'd never had to ask permission to belong. So he started asking questions of his own, quietly at first, then loudly. How many of our programs are designed for people who already have someone? What do we do for the ones who don't? Where do the kids go who don't have names on their pickup sheets? His team blinked at first. They were used to Elias showing up with polished speeches, not with fire in his eyes and the ghost of a child's voice in his chest. But they adjusted, because he didn't let up. He showed up early, stayed late, met with community leaders, sat in schools, listened to youth shelters, spoke to counselors and educators and kids themselves. The Welcome Project became more than a sketch. It became a blueprint. The first program launched that fall. Saturday dinners held in community centers with no requirements, no paperwork, no RSVPs. The only rule was that if you showed up, there would be a seat, a plate, a name tag waiting. People came. Teenagers, grandparents, single parents with kids, young people with nowhere to go, and nothing to prove. And always, at least one person who looked like they didn't believe it was real until they walked through the door. The first evening, Elias sat at one of the folding tables in a borrowed cafeteria, sharing a plate of pasta with a boy named Milo, who asked him, "So are you a volunteer or something?" Elias shook his head. "Just someone who didn't like how many doors were closed." Milo nodded. "I think I've walked past those doors." "Did you ever knock?" "Once." "What happened?" No one answered. Elias didn't offer a speech. He didn't try to explain what should have happened. He just passed Milo a second roll and said, "I'm glad you knocked again." And that became the motto, in a way. It wasn't printed on flyers or painted on banners, but it was passed from hand to hand in paper napkins and handshakes and quiet conversations. I'm glad you knocked again, because knocking took courage. But staying, letting someone in, that took more. Still, even as the project grew, Elias couldn't stop thinking about Devon. He didn't know where they'd gone after the banquet. There had been no return address, no follow-up, just that note, that drawing, and the unmistakable sense that something about that moment had rewritten him from the inside out. He kept his eyes open, asked around discreetly. Nothing. Until one evening in late November, he walked into one of the new Welcome Project locations, a rec center converted into a shared dinner space on weekends. And there they were. Devon, same hoodie, different shoes, hair slightly longer, sitting at the end of a table eating spaghetti and reading a book with a spine so cracked it had likely been passed through many hands. Elias froze for half a second, then walked over slowly. He didn't want to overwhelm, just to be sure. When he reached the table, Devon looked up, their eyes lit, not wide with surprise, but with a kind of quiet that said, "I wondered if you'd find me again." "I was starting to think maybe I dreamed you," Elias said, voice low. Devon smiled. "You didn't." "May I sit?" Devon nodded. "There's always room." So he sat. And for the next hour, they ate together, talked about books, the cold coming in too early this year, the difference between being alone and being lonely, no mention of the banquet, no need. And just before Devon left, after Elias offered a ride, which they declined, saying, "I know my way," they turned, pulled something from their jacket pocket, and handed it to him. It was a crumpled flyer, the original one from the Banquet, the one that had said, "Families Welcome." Devin had written something new on the bottom, in pen. Sometimes you have to redefine the word. Then they smiled, turned, and disappeared out the door into the cold. Elias stood there for a long time, flyer in hand, and a heart too full for words, because some people don't ask for much. Just a seat, just a name, just permission to stay. And the right to ask, "Am I allowed?" And all he could think, all he could know, was this: you always were. December arrived with a kind of hush that wrapped the city in softness. The wind got sharper, the nights stretched longer, and inside the offices of the Cole Foundation, lights stayed on later than usual, not because the staff was racing toward deadlines, but because Elias had insisted they finish something new before the end of the year. A revised charter, a reimagined purpose, one that didn't just include the word family in a tagline, but actually meant it, one that didn't assume everyone had a table to return to, or a name to write on the emergency contact form, or a place where they were simply allowed to exist without needing to earn it. The final draft of the new mission statement ended with a sentence Elias had scribbled down late one night and never changed again. "We are here for the ones still waiting at the door." On the weekend before Christmas, the Welcome Project hosted its first winter celebration. No tickets, no seating chart, no requirements. Just long tables covered in mismatched tablecloths, rows of folding chairs, and volunteers with flour on their faces passing out warm rolls to anyone who wanted one. Elias arrived early and stayed late. Devin showed up halfway through, bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big, bear drawn in Sharpie on the back of their backpack. They found Elias in the kitchen, elbow deep in a tray of lasagna he'd insisted on helping serve. "I thought you didn't do aprons," Devin said. "I didn't," he replied, "until I found out they come with utility pockets." Devin grinned, then grew more serious. "I've been thinking about that night, the one at the hotel." Elias wiped his hands and leaned against the counter. "Me too. I was never supposed to be there, not officially. I walked 5 blocks after I saw the flyer. I almost didn't stop." "Why did you?" Devin shrugged. "I don't know, hope maybe, or something that looked like it." Elias nodded slowly. "Do you regret it?" "No," they said. "But sometimes I wonder, if I hadn't said anything, if I'd just stood there quietly, would anyone have noticed?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I don't know about anyone else, but I would have." Devin smiled again. "That's what I thought." The night ended with cocoa and music, and someone in the back playing piano in a way that felt like a memory. Devin sat beside Elias on the edge of the stage, sipping from a paper cup. "You know," Devin said, "you've done a lot since that night." "You started it," Elias replied. "I didn't do anything." "You asked the question." They were quiet for a while, then Devin whispered, "Do you think that question ever stops being scary?" "No," Elias said, "but the right answer makes it worth asking." Devin finished their cocoa. "Then I'm glad I asked you." The next day, a new flyer was printed for all Welcome Project locations to use. At the top in bold, "You're allowed." And below that, smaller, in Devin's handwriting, "You don't need a last name, or a +1, or a story that makes people clap. You just need a chair, and maybe someone who remembers you asked." Elias read it a dozen times before placing a copy on his desk, right beside Devin's original note. And he realized fully and finally that every room he'd ever stood in before that one had been missing something, not applause, not prestige, but the sound of a voice, small, tired, honest, asking to be let in, and the man who finally learned to say yes. New Year's Eve came quietly. No banquets, no rooftop countdowns, no camera crews, just a snow-dusted sidewalk, a string of lights above a community center, and tables set with mismatched mugs full of cider. Elias sat in the back corner of the room, watching a dozen different lives unfold in the same space. A little girl braided a volunteer's hair. A boy quietly drew monsters on the back of a paper plate. Two teens sat shoulder to shoulder on the windowsill, sharing a single pair of earbuds. A woman who hadn't spoken much since she arrived hummed along with the off-key piano version of Auld Lang Syne, like it was the only song that ever meant anything. Devon sat across from him, sipping from a chipped mug, with steam fogging their glasses. "Do you miss the old way?" they asked. Elias looked up. The galas, the headlines, the feeling of being the person who gets introduced with a paragraph instead of a handshake. Elias thought about it. "Sometimes I miss the certainty," he admitted, "the predictability of knowing what a room wants from you before you even walk into it. But not the weight of it," he smiled. "That part I'm glad to be rid of." Devon nodded. "You look lighter." "Is that a compliment?" "Yeah," they said, "the best kind." Outside, the countdown had begun. Somewhere in the city, not here. There was no giant screen, no confetti cannon, just the faint echo of people counting down somewhere else. But in this room, no one was rushing. No one was waiting for a clock to tell them when the new year had begun. They were already living it. At 12:01, a kid dropped a cookie. Someone laughed. Bear fell out of a coat pocket and got dusted off. A paper crown got passed from one person to another until it landed unexpectedly in Elias's lap. He held it up. "This looks familiar." Devon tilted their head. "Try it on." He raised an eyebrow. "Come on," Devon said. "You earned it." He placed it gently on his head. It sat crooked, cheap, plastic, and yet it fit. A few minutes later he stood to speak. Just briefly, just to the room, no stage, no mic. He cleared his throat, and the conversations dimmed. "I don't have a speech," he said, "but I do have something I've learned." They waited. "I used to think legacy was about what you build," he said, "the things that stay behind with your name on them." He looked around, at the mismatched chairs, the stories in progress, the quiet yeses, and the louder ones. "But now I think legacy is about what you make space for. It's the door you leave open, the chair you pull out, the moment you say to someone, 'You're allowed,' and mean it." He paused, and then softly he added, "And to the one who reminded me, thank you. I will never forget that you asked." He caught Devon's eye. They nodded once, and he knew. It was more than a moment. It was the beginning of 100 others. The first Monday after the new year, Elias arrived at the Welcome Project's downtown location just before sunset. The rec center buzzed with quiet movement, volunteers prepping dinner, folding chairs being set up in circles instead of rows. A new routine based on Devon's suggestion. Don't line people up like they're waiting for something. Let them face each other. Let them be seen. Elias moved through the room, his suit jacket replaced with a knit sweater and rolled sleeves. He wasn't the kind of leader who sat above any more. Now he moved tables. He stirred soup. He sat with strangers like they had already met. At 6:15 p.m., as the first guests arrived, he looked up from setting out napkins and saw someone hovering by the entrance. A boy, maybe 10, maybe a small 12, standing just outside the threshold, shoulders curled in, a beanie too large for his head, hands jammed deep into the pockets of a coat that didn't quite fit. Elias recognized the posture before the face. It was the posture of someone hoping to be noticed without being called out. He stepped away from the tables and walked toward the door. The boy glanced up. Elias offered a small nod. The boy shifted, hesitated, then took one step inside. "It's open," Elias said gently. "Always is." "They said it's for families," the boy replied, voice soft but steady. Elias felt the words land in his chest like they always did. "Are you a family?" The boy shrugged. "Not really." Elias stepped aside and gestured toward the room. "Then you're still allowed." The boy looked at him, eyebrows low. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He walked in slow, tentative, as if each step might change someone's mind. Elias didn't ask questions, just walked beside him. Led him to a table near the back where 3 other guests were quietly talking about their favorite cartoons growing up. There was an empty chair, a clean plate. "Can I sit here?" the boy asked. Elias looked around the table. "Is there room?" The others nodded. The boy sat. Elias walked back to the kitchen, and he didn't cry, but he did grip the edge of the sink and close his eyes for a moment, because it had happened again. Another voice, another child, another variation of the same quiet plea. They said it's for families. Am I allowed? And the answer, again and again, had to be yes. But not just a yes spoken out loud. A yes lived, a yes that made room, a yes that built new definitions of what family could be. That night, after cleanup, Devin found Elias sitting on the steps outside the rec center, jacket open to the cold. They sat beside him, elbows touching. "He reminded you, didn't he?" Devin asked. Elias nodded. Devin didn't press, didn't need to. "Do you think," they said after a while, "that maybe the door we open for other people is also the one we were locked out of once?" Elias looked over. "I think that's the only door that really matters." Devin reached into their coat and handed him something folded. Another drawing. A table. 7 chairs. Only 3 were filled. The rest were labeled with question marks. At the bottom, in Devin's handwriting, "Leave them open. Someone is coming." Elias folded the paper carefully, slipped it into his pocket, and whispered, "They'll be welcome when they do." The next morning, Elias was already in his office before the city fully woke up. The sky was still pale gray, and the lights outside his window flickered in sleepy patterns. On his desk sat a small stack of handwritten notes, testimonies from welcome project guests collected over the past 3 months. Stories scribbled in pencil and pen. Some were only a few lines, others spilled onto multiple pages. Most were unsigned. One in particular caught his eye. "I used to think family meant a table you were born into. Now I think it means someone saving you a seat, even when you didn't know they knew your name. I never asked, but someone answered anyway. That's what love sounds like." He set the paper down and stared at it for a long while, not with sadness, but with reverence. He'd stopped trying to build systems that only worked for those who knew how to ask. Now he was building something that noticed without permission. That afternoon, during a team meeting, Elias surprised everyone when he pulled out the original Banquet flyer, the one Devin had rewritten at the bottom. "Families welcome." It had started as a slogan, now it was a mission. He tapped the corner of the page. "We're changing what this means." A staff member hesitated. "To what?" Elias smiled. "To include people who don't think they belong here yet." He turned and wrote it on the whiteboard behind him, word by word. "Family =, whoever you hold a seat for." There was a silence in the room, and then someone asked, "So what do we call it now?" And someone else said quietly, "Home." Elias nodded. "Exactly." By the end of the week, the new flyers were out. Same colors, same font, but this time, at the top it read, "Welcome Home," and underneath, smaller, "You're allowed, you're enough, you're already part of the story." The next event pulled in more than 100 people, and among them, Elias noticed more first-timers than ever. A teen girl holding her younger brother's hand like a shield. An elderly man who walked in holding a paper napkin folded into a crown. A woman with red-rimmed eyes who only asked for tea. A boy in a yellow hoodie who stood at the door for a full 20 minutes before finally stepping inside. Elias walked over to that boy. No clipboard, no speech, just presence. "You're here," he said. The boy shrugged. "I don't know if I'm supposed to be." "You are," Elias said, like it was the most obvious truth in the world, "but I'm not with anyone." "That doesn't change your worth." The boy blinked. "Then, where do I sit?" Elias turned and pointed to a table near the window where the light landed soft and golden. "Right there. We've been waiting." The boy walked forward slowly, like the room might disappear if he moved too fast, but it didn't. It stayed, and so did he. That night, as the room emptied and chairs were folded, Elias found Devin near the stage, helping a younger kid stack leftover plates into a crate. "They're starting to show up on their own," Devin said, "because the door stays open." Devin looked up. "You know what I think the real question is now?" "What's that?" "Not am I allowed, but can I stay?" Elias smiled. "And the answer?" Devin didn't hesitate. "Yes, please do." By mid-January, The Welcome Project had outgrown its borrowed spaces. The community center could no longer hold the wave of people arriving every week, not just for meals or events, but for what the flyers had promised and what the room had delivered, the feeling of being allowed. Elias stood in the middle of one of the final dinners in the original space, watching people linger long after the food was gone. No one wanted to leave. A kid was drawing chalk outlines of constellations on the floor. Two teens braided each other's hair on the windowsill. An older couple sat near the piano, quietly reading poetry to one another, one line at a time. It didn't feel like a program anymore. It felt like a living room that had opened its arms wide enough to fit the world. "We need more space," someone whispered behind him. He turned, one of the volunteers. "I know," Elias said. "I think we need a house." It started as an idea that night. By morning it was a plan. Elias didn't want another center, not a facility, not a new wing of a foundation named after him. He wanted something quieter, softer, a house that looked like a home, with creaky floorboards and bookshelves full of mismatched paperbacks, with a kitchen where you could sit at the counter and cry into your tea, and someone would simply pass you a napkin instead of a form. He found the house within 2 weeks. It was on a corner lot near a park, ivy crawling up one side, a crooked gate that squeaked when you opened it. It had been a foster home once, long ago. The rooms were small but warm. The living room had a fireplace with soot still on the brick. The windows didn't match. Neither did the doorknobs. It was perfect. He bought it quietly, no press, no announcement, just a handwritten sign he taped to the window the first day the door was unlocked. "Welcome home." People started coming before the paint had even dried. Devin showed up with Bear in one hand and a bucket of buttons in the other. "These are for the listening room," they said, "in case someone needs to fidget while they talk." Elias blinked. "The listening room?" Devin pointed to the front parlor. "That's what we're calling it now. It doesn't need to be for meetings. It needs to be for hearing." So it was. By the end of the first week, there was a board in the hallway titled "The Wall of Stayed." On it, people could write one sentence, anonymously or not, about the moment they realized someone stayed. Some read, "When she asked if I was okay and didn't look away when I said no. When he brought me soup without asking if I wanted it first. When I left the door unlocked and they came back anyway. When they remembered my name after I'd only said it once." Elias read every one, and he added one of his own, "When someone asked if they were allowed, and I said yes, and meant it with my whole life." That night, as snow began to dust the streets outside the new house, Elias stood at the kitchen counter stirring tea while Devin sorted a stack of new flyers. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. But as they passed one another by the doorway, Devin looked up and said, "This is the place I wanted to walk into the first time, the one I was hoping existed." Elias didn't respond with words. He just nodded and placed a new pot on the stove for cocoa, because he knew what Devin was really saying. "Thank you for building the room you once needed." And all Elias could think was, "Thank you for waiting until I was ready." February brought more than snow. It brought stories. People who had visited the house once began coming back, not for food, not for warmth, just to be there, to sit in the quiet or by the fireplace or on the back porch where Devin had set up a thinking bench with a note. "Sit here if you're not ready to talk, but hope someone might sit next to you anyway." People started sitting there, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, and sometimes someone joined them. Elias watched it happen again and again. A kid sitting on the bench with their chin tucked into their hoodie, a woman in a nurse uniform staring at her hands, a man with paint on his jeans trying not to cry, all of them sitting still, waiting, hoping. And eventually, someone would walk out, another guest, a volunteer, a stranger who'd become a not stranger, and sit next to them. No questions, just presence. That was the point. That was the promise. One afternoon, Elias stood in the hallway reading the newest additions to The Wall of Stayed when a girl around 9 or 10 brushed past him and pinned something to the bottom corner. He only caught it out of the corner of his eye, and when he turned, she was already gone. He stepped forward. The note was written in a wobbly scrawl on the back of a diner napkin. It said, "They said it was only for people who already had someone, but he said start here." And that was enough. Elias stared at it for a long time. Later that evening, he brought Devin a cup of hot tea and handed them the napkin. Devin read it, then looked up. "That sounds like the front door." Elias nodded. "It is the front door." Devin reached for a piece of tape. "Let's move this one to the top of the wall." They did, pinned it right in the center, above every other quote. A new header was scribbled on an index card and placed above it, in Devin's writing, "The Beginning," and underneath, the napkin. "Start here." The next day, a boy came in with a skateboard tucked under one arm and a hoodie zipped all the way to his nose. He walked up to Elias and said, "Is this the place that says yes?" Elias replied, "It's the place that doesn't ask for proof." The boy nodded. "Okay, just checking." He stayed all afternoon. Didn't talk much. But he sat in the kitchen long enough to finish 2 bowls of soup and smile once when someone passed him a marker and a blank page. That evening, as the lights dimmed and chairs were stacked, Elias walked to the front door, leaned against the frame, and looked out into the falling snow. He didn't know who would come next, didn't know what question they'd carry with them, but he knew what the answer would be. It would be a room, a chair, a hand extended, and a voice that said, "Start here." By mid-February, the "Start Here" napkin had become more than a quote. It had become a movement. Guests began adding to it, not in words, but in actions. A new basket appeared beside the front door, filled with hand warmers and snacks. No note, just a small sign that read, "Take what you need. No one's watching." Someone else left a pair of winter boots with a tag. "Worn once. Still warm. I want the next person to get there dry." And slowly, almost quietly, the house became more than just a place where people showed up. It became a place where they stayed, where they returned, not for what they could get, but for what they could give. Not because they had nowhere else to go, but because no other place had made them feel like they truly belonged. One Wednesday evening, Elias stood by the stove, stirring a pot of chili, when he heard laughter ripple through the back porch. Real, full-bodied laughter, the kind that startled him because it sounded like joy. He peeked out the window. Devin was sitting on the steps with 3 kids, all younger, all wearing paper crowns someone had clearly made by hand. One crown said, "I belong." Another said, "Stayed." The third, slightly crooked, simply said, "Me." They weren't talking about anything important, just the way cats always seem to know when you're sad, and the weird smell of old pencils, and whether it's okay to talk to your stuffed animals if you're technically too old by school rules. Elias stepped outside and sat beside them, silent. One of the younger kids looked up at him. "You run the house, right?" Elias nodded. "I help take care of it." The boy squinted. "Did someone make it for you?" "No," Elias said, "but someone reminded me it needed to exist." The boy nodded like that made sense. "It feels like it's been here forever." "That's how you know it's real," Devin added. "The good things always feel like they've been waiting for us to catch up." Later, when the kids had all gone home and the lights were off except for the glow from the fireplace, Devin handed Elias a folded piece of notebook paper. It was another drawing. This one showed the house lit up like a lantern. Inside the windows were small figures, some alone, some paired, some clustered in groups. But each one had a word floating above their head. Welcome. Seen. Heard. Enough. At the bottom, Devin had drawn a figure standing at the door. No name, no face, just a question mark. "That's the next person," Devin said, "the one who doesn't know it yet." Elias swallowed. "Do you think they'll ask?" "They always ask," Devin said, "even if it's just with their eyes." Elias placed the drawing on the mantel beside the "Start Here" napkin. They didn't match. They didn't have to, because this wasn't about perfection. It was about permission. Permission to enter. Permission to belong. Permission to say, "I don't know where else to go," and have someone answer, "You've already made it." That night, Elias wrote something new in his journal, a question he never wanted to forget. How many lives can change just because someone hears a knock and opens the door wide enough? March arrived with pale sunlight and the first hints of thaw, slush in the gutters, the slow drip of melting ice from the house's porch roof, and a softness in the air that hadn't been there since winter began. The front yard still crunched underfoot, but people were lingering a little longer before coming inside, like the breeze itself was whispering, "You've made it through." The house began filling up earlier in the day. More guests arrived before lunch. Some came just to sit. Others brought things, books, extra coats, drawings on crumpled printer paper. The wall of staid had grown so much that they'd moved it to the hallway and started a second one in the kitchen. This one had a different name, Wall of Asked. Each note began with the same word. Can I sit with you even if I don't talk? Can I be here if I don't know how to belong? Can I take a second helping if I didn't finish the first? Can I stay even if I wasn't invited the first time? Elias read every single one. He answered them silently, by keeping the lights on and the doors open, by rearranging the chairs so no one ever had to sit alone, by making sure there were always second helpings, even for the ones who asked in whispers or eye contact alone. And sometimes he answered with words. On a chilly Friday evening, a girl about 9 years old came in just as they were closing up. Her hair was damp, shoes soaked through. She hovered at the edge of the entryway, eyes flicking from the welcome sign to the coat rack to the firelight coming from the next room. Elias stepped forward. "Hi," he said gently. She didn't answer at first. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, she asked, "Can I come in even if I don't have a reason?" Elias smiled. "You don't need one." She crossed the threshold cautiously and stood there as someone handed her a dry towel and a mug of cocoa. Devin brought her a blanket without a word and sat beside her on the couch while Bear stared up from the armrest with a quiet kind of pride. Later that night, after she'd fallen asleep in the listening room, curled up beside a donated quilt and a book she hadn't finished, Elias found a note left near the front door, written on the back of an old grocery receipt. It said, "They said it's for families. You didn't ask me who I was. You just made space. And I filled it. Is that what family means?" He folded the note and placed it inside the growing binder of stories they'd begun collecting, a binder that Devin had labeled "Proof the World Still Works" in thick black marker. At the top of the next staff meeting, Elias read that note aloud. Then he said, "We don't need a bigger house. We need more homes like this." The room fell quiet, until one of the volunteers, someone who had once stood at that door with the same fear, the same question, raised their hand and said, "Then, let's make them." And just like that, it became real. The Welcome Project would expand, not as a franchise, not as a branded initiative, but as a belief. Everyone deserves to be allowed in, even if they don't know how to ask, even if they think they aren't allowed, even if they've never been welcomed anywhere before, especially then. By the end of March, the Welcome Project was no longer just a house with open doors. It was a spark that had caught and spread, quietly, deliberately, heart by heart. Other communities had begun reaching out. Teachers, shelter coordinators, librarians, youth counselors. They weren't asking for a blueprint. They were asking for the feeling. How do we make a place feel like this? How do we build what you built? How do we say yes the way you did? Elias didn't send them manuals. He sent them stories, pages from the Wall of Staid, quotes from the Wall of Asked, photos of the thinking bench. A scanned copy of Devin's original napkin, still smudged but powerful. Start here. And along with it, he sent this. Don't build a perfect program. Build a soft landing. Don't wait for permission. Open the door before someone knocks. Family isn't something you assign. It's something you make room for. One of the first partner spaces to open was a small library in a rural town 3 hours away. The librarian was a quiet man in his 60s who had read about the Welcome Project in a local newsletter and driven all the way to the city just to sit in the kitchen for a few hours and feel it. Before leaving, he'd said, "I've got a table, I've got a kettle. I just never thought those things were enough." Elias had replied, "They are." When that new space opened, the first person through the door was a teenager who hadn't spoken more than a full sentence in weeks. They sat at the table, said nothing, just stared at the mug in front of them. And when the librarian asked gently, "Would you like to talk?" the teen said, "No, but I want to stay." It was the same story over and over, different words, different people, but always the same truth. We're all just looking for a place to set down our weight. Back in the original house, things continued. More notes appeared on the wall of Ast. One said, "Can I stop pretending I'm okay?" Another, "Can I be angry and still be loved here?" Devin started pinning answers underneath each one, short, firm, written in red pen. Yes, 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 always. One night, Elias found them standing alone in the hallway, staring at the wall with tired eyes. "You okay?" he asked. Devin nodded slowly. "It just feels like the world is finally listening, and that's a lot." "It is," Elias said, "but it's happening because of you." Devin looked up. "It's happening because someone answered a question the right way." Elias smiled. "I still hear it in my sleep," he said softly. "That first voice. They said it's for families. Am I allowed?" Devin nodded. "You didn't answer it with a sentence. You answered it with your life." Elias swallowed hard. They stood there for a long time. Outside, the trees were just starting to bud. The sky was soft with early spring. Inside, the door stayed open. April brought sunlight through the windows at angles that warmed the wooden floorboards of the house. Kids sprawled on the rugs in the listening room, heads propped on donated pillows, sketching or journaling, or just sitting in the rare, sacred kind of quiet where no one expected them to explain themselves. The smell of baked bread drifted from the kitchen, and someone had written, "You're allowed to rest here," in watercolor letters across the hallway mirror. It was Devin's idea to host the first permission day. No speeches, no lessons, just a question, written in big letters on a canvas taped to the living room wall. "What do you need permission to do?" Underneath it, people wrote their answers. To cry without fixing it first. To talk about the person I lost, even if no one knew them. To laugh even though things are still hard. To start over. To not start at all just yet. Elias stood in front of the wall for a long time. He didn't write anything at first. But later that night, after the rooms had quieted and the guests had gone, he returned with a marker and wrote, "To belong, without having to prove, I do." He capped the pen and set it down gently. Devin watched from the next room. "That was the first thing you gave me," they said. "What?" "Belonging without proof." Elias turned. "And you gave me a reason to keep giving it." Devin smiled. In late April, the house received a letter, handwritten in blue ink, with no return address. It read, "I passed by this house 3 times before I had the courage to step inside. Each time I thought, maybe not me." The last time, I heard someone laugh through the open window, and it sounded like I used to before things got hard. That's what pulled me in. I still don't know what I need, but I know I'm not invisible here, and that's more than enough for now. The letter was pinned beside the "Start Here" napkin. Someone added a note below it in red ink. "You are seen. You are staying. We're already saving your seat." Word spread. More houses began asking to be part of the Welcome Project. People were no longer requesting funding. They were requesting faith. They weren't saying, "Show us how." They were saying, "Remind us we can." Elias and Devin began traveling on weekends, visiting cities and towns, helping plant the seeds of what they had found. In each place, they told the same story. Not the story of a billionaire or a foundation or a perfect model, but the story of a child standing at a banquet door, asking the simplest question anyone could ever ask. They said, "It's for families. Am I allowed?" And the man who said yes, and kept saying yes, until yes turned into a home, until yes turned into a movement, until yes became a doorway that stayed open long after the question was finished being asked. By early May, Elias had lost count of how many times he'd heard the same story retold by different voices. A boy in Minnesota, a grandmother in Tucson, a teenager in a rain-soaked shelter in Vermont. Different words, same ache. Different cities, same question. They had all waited in some hallway, some lobby, some school office or clinic or group home, hoping that when they finally asked to be let in, the answer wouldn't break them. And now, in more than a dozen cities, the answer was yes. Not just in theory, but in walls that stayed warm, in doors that didn't lock, in community fridges stocked not with leftovers, but the best people had to offer, in shelves filled with books labeled, "You don't need a library card here." In a line someone painted across the top of one house's front porch. "This is where we unlearn being invisible." Elias found himself quiet more often these days, not because he had nothing to say, but because he finally understood that holding space was sometimes louder than speaking. The original house still stood on its corner lot, ivy creeping higher along the bricks, wind chimes in the kitchen window catching late spring breezes. Devin had started keeping a journal in the listening room, a public one where guests could write to each other, not as messages, but as memories. The front page had a single line in thick black ink. Write what you couldn't say when you didn't know if you were allowed to say anything at all. By mid-month, the journal had dozens of entries. I didn't know I needed someone to sit beside me until someone already had. I still don't know how to explain why I left home, but here no one asks me to. He said the lights stay on all night. I stayed until morning. I think I might do it again. One evening, Elias stood on the front porch watching the sun sink low when Devin joined him, barefoot, holding 2 mugs of tea. "I've been thinking," Devin said, handing him a mug. "That usually means I need to cancel tomorrow's meetings." Devin grinned. "Maybe." They both stared out at the street in silence. Then Devin said, "Do you think we'll ever stop needing to remind people they're allowed in?" Elias took a long sip of his tea before answering. "I think the reminders are the work, and the people who once asked, they become the ones who answer next." "So it spreads?" "It already is." Devin leaned against the railing. "It's strange, isn't it? The most world-changing thing we ever did was sit down next to someone who didn't expect us to stay." Elias looked at them. It wasn't strange, it was necessary. And that was the thing. Every headline about the Welcome Project focused on the growth, the expansion, the innovation. But that wasn't the story. The real story was a little voice at a banquet door asking, "Am I allowed?" And someone choosing to say yes, to stay, to build a world where no one had to ask again. By late May, the Welcome Project's name was appearing in articles, speeches, and even classrooms. A senator quoted its motto on the floor of Congress. A teacher built a curriculum around its founding principles: openness, presence, trust. A podcast dedicated a full series to the stories written on its walls. Elias kept none of the articles on his desk. Instead, he kept Devin's first note, the one on the napkin, the words that had shifted everything. "They said it's for families. Am I allowed?" And now, after months and miles and voices and rooms, the question had become an anthem, not because it demanded an answer, but because it gave people the courage to ask. At the original house, the days were longer now. The sunlight hit different. The doors were never closed. The porch chairs had worn in just enough to creak a little when someone sat down. A comforting sound, familiar, safe. That weekend they hosted something Devin called the Never Asked Celebration. It wasn't a party. It wasn't even on the calendar. It was for the people who had never gotten to say what they needed to say. The only invitation was a sign on the front window that read, "Tonight is for the ones who stayed silent when it mattered most. Speak now, or don't. Either way, we'll be here." People came, not all at once, but enough. One woman brought a violin and played near the fireplace for 20 minutes. When she finished, she didn't say anything, just nodded, packed up, and left. A young boy wrote a letter on a paper towel and taped it to the listening room wall. It said, I kept thinking someone would come back. They didn't. But then someone else came instead. And they stayed. That's what fixed it. Elias stood in the hallway at the end of the night alone, the floor quiet beneath his feet, the lights low. He found himself whispering aloud without meaning to. I didn't fix anything. Devon, sitting on the stairs behind him, said, You didn't need to. You answered. That stuck with him. The next morning, he added a new note to the journal in the listening room. Just one line, under the heading, What I Never Said But Should Have. His note read, I was waiting too. Later that week, as he stood outside the second welcome house that had just opened in a neighborhood that had long been ignored, a girl tugged on his sleeve. She couldn't have been older than 7. Hair in braids, eyes too serious for her age. Are you the guy who says yes? She asked. Elias knelt to her level. I try to be. She pointed to the banner across the door. Welcome home. Is it really for everyone? She asked. He nodded, even the people who didn't think to ask. She looked up at him. I don't have a family. You do now. And then she walked through the door. No hesitation, no need to knock, no need to ask. Because someone had already made space. June brought a quiet kind of warmth to the original house, not just in temperature, but in spirit. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It had never been just that. Now it felt like something that pulsed. It breathed. It remembered. The walls were covered with more than stories now. There were strings of paper hearts, each with a name. Devon had hung them one by one, labeled with words that had nothing to do with identity and everything to do with feeling. Safe, chosen, seen, waiting, healing, enough. Elias came down the stairs one morning and found a small group of kids around the kitchen table, cutting out more hearts. One boy was carefully tracing the word possible in gold marker. He asked no one in particular, Do we have room for more? Devon answered from the other side of the room without looking up. Always. Outside, the sidewalk chalk had been replaced with real paint. A mural had begun to take shape along the side of the house. It wasn't designed by an artist. It wasn't funded. It was built slowly, with the hands of those who came through. At first it had just been outlines, hands reaching for one another, stars, flowers blooming between cracks in the concrete. But then came words, not names, sentences, fragments, pledges. I stayed. I asked. I came back. I made room. I didn't leave. I thought I'd never be chosen. I was. Elias stood before the wall one afternoon, arms crossed, eyes scanning the images. Devon stepped beside him, a cup of iced tea in one hand, a paint-streaked rag in the other. People keep asking if we're going to clear some space. Elias raised an eyebrow. For what? Devon smiled. For what comes next. That night someone rang the bell at 11:45 p.m. Elias was the one still awake, cleaning mugs and wiping down the counter in the back kitchen. He opened the door to find a teenage girl standing there alone, shoulders slouched forward under an oversized hoodie. She held nothing but a piece of paper in her hand. It was folded into a perfect square. He didn't speak. He just stepped aside. She walked in without looking up, went straight to the listening room, and curled up on the old couch. In the morning, the paper was still there. She had left it on the kitchen table, weighed down by a salt shaker. Devon found it first. They read it once, then passed it to Elias. He opened it slowly. Inside, in sharp handwriting, were only 4 lines. I didn't think I'd be brave enough to ask, so I didn't. But someone still opened the door. And that's how I knew I didn't have to beg to belong. He placed it on the wall of Asked himself, pinned it in the center, and then wrote beneath it in red marker, This was never about being ready. It was always about being welcomed anyway. By mid-June, the Welcome House had become more than a building. It had turned into a rhythm. People didn't just come and go. They circled back. They brought friends. They brought old photos. They brought pieces of their lives they hadn't shown anyone in years or ever. A woman arrived one day with a duffel bag full of children's books and no explanation. She simply said, These were mine when I thought no one would ever read to me again. Now I want someone else to have them. They built a bookshelf around her, right then and there. A little sign above it in Devon's handwriting read, "Books for the days you feel like starting over." Elias began to notice how often people lingered in the front yard, not just at the door, on the steps, near the bench. Standing beside the chalkboard someone had propped against the fence, where the question of the week was always scrawled in colored chalk. One week the question was, "What would you say to the version of you who almost didn't come?" By the end of the day the board was full. You were worth the risk. You were already becoming. Thank you for giving me the chance to meet this version of us. They said it was for families. You asked anyway. I'm proud of that. On the porch that night, Elias and Devon sat side by side, listening to wind move through the ivy. The house creaked occasionally, as if it were exhaling from the weight of all it had carried. Elias was holding a cup of coffee. Devon was holding Bear. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally Devon said, "Do you think we'll ever run out of people to open the door for?" Elias shook his head. "Not a chance." "I used to think places like this were rare," Devon said, "but now I think they're just waiting to be noticed, or started." Elias looked over. "You're going to start one, aren't you?" Devon didn't answer. But the next morning they were already sketching a floor plan on the back of a napkin. They called it the second door. Because, as Devon explained to anyone who asked, sometimes people need to try more than once, and when they do, the second door should still be open. That afternoon, a boy with no backpack and a face full of hesitation stood outside the fence. He didn't knock, didn't call out. He just waited, hands in his pockets, shoes too tight. Elias saw him from the porch and stood. He didn't ask a name, and he didn't ask a reason. He just walked over slow and steady and said, "We saved you a seat?" The boy blinked. "You don't even know if I deserve it." Elias smiled. "The seat isn't given based on what you've done. It's given because you asked." "I didn't ask. You showed up, that counts." And with that the boy stepped forward. The door swung open behind them. And another story began. By the end of June, something unexpected began to happen at the Welcome House. People who had once come through its doors hesitant, silent, carrying the weight of questions they didn't feel allowed to ask, began returning not with uncertainty, but with purpose. They came not just to receive, but to hold the door open behind them. A man who used to sit by the radiator every Tuesday, never speaking a word, began showing up early to make tea, not just for himself, but for others. A simple paper taped to the wall above the mugs read, "Ask me for your cup, I want to get it right." A mother who had come through in tears one December morning, child on her hip and fear in her eyes, now spent her Saturdays reading picture books aloud in the listening room. She'd once asked, "Can I be a good mom if I don't know what I'm doing?" And the answer had been, "Yes, just sit down. We'll do it with you." And now she read with a voice that carried hope into every word. Even the house itself had started changing, not through renovation, but through accumulation, of intention, of memories, of presence. The walls were covered with drawings. Windowsills held jars of marbles and affirmation cards left anonymously. The kitchen corkboard overflowed with questions and answers, folded paper scraps, lists of names for people who wanted to volunteer but hadn't yet found the right way to say it out loud. On a warm Friday afternoon, Devon walked in carrying a cardboard box. Elias was in the hallway organizing a shelf that had somehow become a collection point for forgotten notebooks and worn-out stuffed animals that no one wanted to throw away. Devon set the box down and said, "I found these in my closet." Elias looked inside. There were drawings, old journals, letters never sent. "I think I need to let go of them," Devon said, "but I don't want them to disappear. They helped me survive once." Elias nodded, then reached toward the shelf beside him, cleared off 3 items, and made space. Together they placed the box there, no label, no plaque, just a small index card that read, "Things that once carried us." That night they added another question to the porch chalkboard. "What did you bring with you the day you came?" The next morning, the board was full, a backpack full of extra shirts I never needed. My brother's name, even though he couldn't come. The sound of a slammed door, a belief I wouldn't be chosen, but I came anyway. Nothing, I brought nothing, and that was enough. Elias read each one slowly, carefully, as if he were reading holy text. He realized then that what they'd built wasn't just a home. It was a mirror. It reflected people back to themselves, but softer, braver, seen. The welcome house didn't offer answers. It offered permission to cry, to laugh, to show up with nothing, to leave with something, to come back, to belong. That afternoon, as a summer storm rolled in and the wind lifted the corners of the porch rug, a girl about 12 walked up the steps, dripping wet from the rain. She had no bag, no umbrella, just a folded flyer in her hand, worn, smeared, almost unreadable. Elias met her at the door. She held out the flyer and said, "Is this still true?" He read it. "Welcome home. You don't need a name or a story, just a reason to stay." He looked at her, rain in her hair, hope in her voice, barely standing. "Yes," he said, "it's still true." She stepped inside. He handed her a towel. Devin handed her cocoa. Someone else handed her bear. And no one asked her why she'd come, because she didn't need a reason. She was already allowed. By early July, the Welcome House had quietly become a landmark, not because of its architecture or its history or any official designation, but because of what it had come to mean to the people who found it. It was marked on hand-drawn maps, passed from one person to another like folklore. People didn't give exact directions. They just said things like, "It's the place where nobody makes you prove you deserve to stay," or "Look for the window with the lamp that's always on, even after midnight." There was no front desk, no sign-in sheet, just the same 3 words on the door. "Start here." That summer, a woman in her late 50s began showing up in the afternoons. She never spoke more than a few words, just brought yarn, lots of it. She sat in the corner of the living room and knitted, scarves mostly, a few hats. No one asked why, but slowly people began sitting near her. One child asked if she could teach them, then another. Then 2 teens who'd sworn they didn't have patience for old people hobbies started crocheting while listening to music through shared earbuds. The woman never said much, but she'd left a note pinned to the wall of Stade one day. "I didn't think I had anything left to give, but it turns out making something with your hands can help keep your heart from breaking." Elias read it twice, then 3 times. He folded it gently and kept it in his wallet for the rest of the summer. Devin, meanwhile, had started writing what they called the Handbook for Houses That Listen. It wasn't meant for distribution. Not yet. But it grew page by page, left on the kitchen counter in a spiral-bound notebook with a marker clipped to the cover. The chapters weren't numbered. They were titled like poems. What to do when someone arrives and doesn't speak. How to say welcome without saying a word. When you realize they're waiting to be told they can leave, and you tell them they don't have to. Inside the back cover, someone had written in pencil, "The first person who makes space for you is the one who makes you real." One evening, Elias came in late from a speaking engagement. He walked through the door quietly, half expecting the house to be still, but instead he heard laughter echoing from the listening room. He stepped inside to find 6 people sitting in a circle on the floor, 2 adults, 3 teenagers, and a child curled up in someone's lap. In the center of the circle was Bear, wearing a hand-knit scarf and a sticker on his chest that read, "Official Greeter." They were telling stories, not dramatic ones, but the kind that sound small and somehow feel enormous when spoken out loud. "I knew I belonged here when someone remembered how I take my tea. I knew I belonged when I cried and no one tried to fix it. I knew I belonged when someone waited outside the bathroom for me just to make sure I came back." Elias didn't interrupt. He just sat in the doorway unseen and let the stories pass through him like light. Later, he added a line to the handbook himself. "You'll know the house is working when people stop looking for the exit and start asking where they can hang their coat." It was a slow change, a quiet one, but it was everywhere. And it all came from one child once, standing outside a door, asking the question that still echoed through every hallway. "They said it's for families. Am I allowed?" And the man who said yes, not just that night, but every day after. By the second week of July, the Welcome House had more keys than anyone expected, not to lock anything up, but to give them away. Devon had the idea first. "We should give people keys when they're ready," they said one morning while sitting on the porch with Elias, legs pulled up on the bench, Bear perched between them, not to make them owners, just to make them known. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Won't that make the place less secure?" "It'll make it more trusted," Devon said, "and trust is better than security anyway." So they began with 3 keys. The first went to a boy named Malik, who had shown up 6 months earlier asking if the house had a lost and found. When Elias told him no, Malik had shrugged and said, "That's okay. I think I lost myself, not a thing." Now Malik came twice a week with extra sandwiches wrapped in foil, never said where they came from, just left them in the fridge with a note that read, "For someone who hasn't eaten today." The second key went to Jamie, a nurse who worked overnight shifts, and sometimes sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, silent, until the sun came up. She never talked about work, never shared her last name. But every morning she left, she restocked the house's tea drawer. No note, no announcement. The third key went to the knitting woman, Lena, who had finally spoken one afternoon as she handed a finished scarf to a teenager heading out the door. "It's okay if you don't know how to ask for warmth," she'd said. "Here, we give it anyway." Elias placed the keys in their palms personally, each one tied to a small tag. "This is yours, not because we owe you anything, but because you made space for someone else." That same week, someone anonymously installed a mailbox on the fence outside. Not for mail, for letters. The first note inside simply read, "I didn't come in today, but knowing you're here is why I got through." By the end of the week, there were dozens more. "I didn't know anyone remembered my birthday. You did." "I used to look for exits. Now I look for lamps. Yours is always on." "I still don't talk much, but I write. And that counts, right?" Elias read them each night, sitting on the porch steps as dusk settled around the house, folding each one carefully and tucking it into a box Devon labeled, "Proof we're getting it right." One day, a new letter appeared, unsigned, scrawled in pencil, the paper soft from folding and unfolding. "I still hear the voice that told me I wasn't enough, but now I hear this one too. You're allowed." And some nights, that's what wins. Elias didn't cry often, but he did that night, because it was working, and not because of him, not because of the funding or the planning or the name, but because the house knew what it was now. It was the answer to the question no one had ever been brave enough to ask aloud, until one child stood at a banquet door and said, "They said it's for families. Am I allowed?" And instead of offering a speech, Elias had done the one thing that could never be forgotten. He opened the door,